Please note, our episodes are best experienced with headphones. You're listening to the Beyond Haunted UK podcast. Before we begin, if you enjoy these stories, I'd really appreciate you following Beyond Haunted UK on Spotify and across social media. It's a small thing, but it does help this project reach people who are looking for this kind of content. This episode contains themes of mental illness, institutionalisation, and human suffering. Some listeners may find parts of this difficult, so please listen with care. My name is Jamie, and thank you for following. This is a space for stories that sit between history, belief, and the human experience. A place where we explore locations, events, and experiences that carry weight, not just because of what people claim to encounter, but because of what those places reveal about us. Here, I want to bring stories that explore the human experience, to document and reflect on what life may be like after death, and to examine the psychological and emotional imprint places can leave behind. We also discuss true crime, and not to sensationalise, but to explore why people behave the way they do, and what might imprint that behaviour leaves on the physical world. And we explore the unexplained, looking beyond the physical realm and beyond our own planet, to consider questions humanity has been asking for millennia. So I ask you to please listen with an open mind. Today, we're travelling to southeastern Pennsylvania in the United States, to a place known as Pennhurst State School and Hospital. In paranormal culture, Pennhurst is often spoken about as one of the most haunted locations in the United States. But long before it became associated with ghost stories and nighttime investigations, Pennhurst was a working institution. A place built with the promise of care. A place that became a symbol of how society once chose to manage difference. And a place where thousands of vulnerable people lived most, and sometimes all, of their lives. This episode explores Pennhurst in full. How it came into being, who was sent there, what daily life looked like behind its walls, how it was exposed to the public, how it closed, and how, in the years since, it has been reframed as a haunted site, carrying a different kind of story about what remains when history is left unresolved. To understand Pennhurst, you have to understand the world that created it. The early 20th century in the United States was marked by rapid industrialisation and urban growth. Cities expanded, factories and railways reshaped how people lived and worked. But social policy struggled to keep pace with social change. Medical understanding of disability, neurodivergence and mental health was limited and often deeply flawed. Conditions such as epilepsy, learning disabilities, autism and intellectual disability were poorly understood. Difference was frequently framed as deviance. People who could not conform to expectations of productivity, behaviour, and independence were often treated as problems to be managed. At the same time, eugenic ideas gained legitimacy within mainstream medicine and social policy. Eugenics promoted the belief that society could be improved by controlling reproduction and segregating those deemed unfit. These ideas shaped sterilisation laws, immigration policy, and the expansion of large state institutions. Pennhurst opened in 1908 under the name the Eastern State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. The language itself reflects the moral and medical framework of the time. People were grouped into categories that erased individuality. Complex human needs were reduced to labels. The institution was presented as progressive, humane, and protective. Families were often told that institutionalisation was the responsible choice, that their children would receive education, training, and specialised care, that the state could provide what families could not. For some parents, this decision came from fear. For others, from pressure by doctors, social workers, or authorities. And for many, it came from a lack of alternatives. Pennhurst was deliberately built away from urban centres. The physical distance mirrored a social distance. Those inside were removed from everyday public life, out of sight and often out of mind. Pennhurst was not solely a psychiatric hospital. Residents included children with learning disabilities, people with epilepsy, autistic individuals, and those with physical impairments, and people labelled as behaviourally difficult. In some cases, individuals were institutionalised primarily because of poverty, lack of family support, or social marginalisation. Many residents were admitted as children, some as young as 5 or 6 years old. For a significant number, Pennhurst was not a temporary placement. It became a long-term residence, and sometimes even a life sentence. Once admitted, leaving was difficult. Families were often told institutionalisation was permanent, that their children would never live independently, that removal from the institution would place them at risk. Over time, Pennhurst became less a place of treatment, and more a place of containment. By the mid-20th century, Pennhurst housed thousands of residents. At its peak, more than 3,000 people lived on the campus. Life inside followed strict routines. Residents were woken, fed, bathed, and housed in large communal wards. Privacy was minimal. Personal possessions were scarce. Individual needs were often secondary to the demands of managing large numbers. Staffing levels were chronically low. Resources were limited, and care often became custodial rather than therapeutic. Former residents, whistleblowers, and later investigations described overcrowded dormitories, inadequate medical care, poor hygiene and sanitation, limited access to education, the use of physical restraints, and instances of neglect and abuse. Residents were often segregated by perceived functioning. Those labelled as more severely disabled were placed in the most overcrowded and under-resourced wards. Children and adults lived in environments where noise, distress, and institutional routine shaped daily experience. Some residents worked within the institution, in laundries, kitchens, and grounds maintenance. This labour was framed as training. In practice, it also helped the institution function with limited funding. For many, Pennhurst became the only world they knew. Family visits were limited, and some residents were forgotten by the outside world entirely. Among the thousands of people who passed through Pennhurst's gates was Roland Johnson. Roland Johnson spent 13 years of his life inside Pennhurst. He entered the institution as a young person and spent much of his adolescence and early adulthood within its wards. Like many residents, his life was shaped by institutional routine, daily schedules, limited autonomy, and a system that defined people primarily by diagnosis rather than individuality. But Roland Johnson's story did not end at Pennhurst. In the early 1970s, as legal challenges to institutional care gathered momentum, he was released. After leaving Pennhurst, Roland Johnson became one of the early voices of the disability self-advocacy movement. He helped to establish organisations that argued for the rights of people with disabilities to live in community settings and to speak for themselves, rather than being spoken for by the institutions. His life stands as a reminder that Pennhurst did not only contain suffering, it contained people with futures beyond its walls. People whose voices had been silenced by systems built to manage them. By the 1960s, attitudes toward disability and institutional care were beginning to shift. Civil rights movements challenged long-standing assumptions about segregation and dignity. In 1968, a televised expose brought Pennhurst into public view. Images of overcrowded wards and residents living in degrading conditions shocked the public, and legal action followed. In 1974, the case Halderman versus Pennhurst State School and Hospital established that residents had a constitutional right to appropriate care in the least restrictive environment possible. This ruling became a landmark moment in the movement away from large-scale institutionalisation. Pennhurst became a national symbol, not just for one of the institution's failures, but for a broader reckoning with how vulnerable populations had been treated across the United States. Pennhurst officially closed in 1987. Residents were relocated into community-based homes and care settings. For some reason, this transition offered autonomy for the first time. For others, the psychological impact of institutional life lingered. Decades spent in controlled environments shaped people's sense of safety, identity, and independence. Closure did not ease trauma. It simply marked the end of one chapter. The physical site was abandoned, buildings deteriorated, and corridors once tightly regulated were left to decay. Nature slowly reclaimed spaces that had once been designed for control. Over time, Pennhurst became a ruin, and ruins attract stories. As Pennhurst faded from its original purpose, new narratives emerged. Paranormal investigators began to visit the site. Stories circulated of voices in empty wards, footsteps in abandoned corridors, apparitions in doorways, and children's laughter echoing through buildings long closed. Visitors report sensations of being watched, sudden changes in temperature, electronic voice phenomena, and figures glimpsed at the end of hallways. For some reason, these experiences are interpreted as the lingering presence of former residents. For others, they are psychological responses to atmosphere, expectation, and the emotional weight of the place. Whether one believes in the paranormal or not, there is something emotionally heavy about spaces where harm occurred. Haunting becomes a language people use to describe that weight, a way of acknowledging that something unresolved remains. But there is also tension here. When sites of trauma become locations for paranormal tourism, there is a risk that memory becomes spectacle, that suffering becomes aesthetic, and that history is felt, but not fully understood. Pennhurst is not just a haunted site. Pennhurst is not just a haunted site. It is a record of how societies once chose to deal with vulnerability. It reflects a time when difference was managed through segregation, when care became institutional, where systems prioritised order over dignity. The people who lived there were not ghosts. They were children and adults with identities, relationships, fears and hopes, lives shaped by circumstances beyond their control. When we walk through abandoned institutions like Pennhurst, we are walking through the architecture of belief. The walls show us what was once considered acceptable. The locked doors reveal what society feared. The silence asks us what we will one day have to answer for. If Pennhurst is haunted, it is haunted not only by stories of spirits, but by the legacy of how vulnerable people were once treated as problems to be managed, rather than lives to be supported. And remembering that matters. If you've enjoyed this story, please follow Beyond Haunted UK across Spotify and social media. Thank you for listening.